A mountain man lived alone for years, until 10 obese girls asked for shelter in his cabin. He thought his cabin in the snowy mountains was the last place anyone would come. But when a knock shattered the silence, the door opened to a sight no one could have imagined. 10 desperate women, abandoned by the town, begging not to die in the cold. At first he meant to send them away, but when the fire lit their faces, he saw more than hunger. He saw courage. He saw hope. And just as life began to stir again in his lonely home, the law came pounding on the door, armed with contracts, threats, and a cruel master who claimed to own them. In a land where paper carried more weight than mercy, one man must decide: obey the law or protect the innocent. But the deeper he fights for them, the darker the truth becomes, because their freedom was never meant to exist. Will the mountain cabin remain a refuge, or will it become a battlefield of justice, faith, and survival? Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect. Robert Boone stood frozen in his doorway, the bitter mountain wind whipping at his face as he stared at the huddle of women before him. Their dresses, meant for warmer days and genteel gatherings, offered little protection against the Colorado winter. Snowflakes caught in their hair and eyelashes, melting into tears that traced down wind-burned cheeks. His first instinct was to shut the door. 10 years of solitude had taught him to be wary of unexpected visitors, especially this high in the Rockies. But something in their desperate faces reminded him of Martha, his dear wife, during that final fever. He couldn't turn away then, and he couldn't turn away now. "Come in," he managed gruffly, stepping aside. "Before you freeze solid?" They stumbled through the door in a rush of skirts and sobbing breaths. The cabin, usually so empty and quiet, suddenly felt cramped with their presence. The rough-hewn walls that had witnessed years of his silence now echoed with the sounds of chattering teeth and muffled crying. "Thank you, sir," one of them whispered, her voice trembling. "We thought we'd die out there." Bob closed the door against the howling wind and studied his unexpected guests in the flickering firelight. They were young, probably no more than 20 or 25 years old, and each carried the fuller figure that had apparently earned them such cruel treatment in Leadville. Their faces showed exhaustion and fear, but also relief as they huddled close to his small fire. "Them folks in town," another woman spoke up, her accent suggesting somewhere back east. "They promised us work and husbands, said they needed women willing to brave the frontier." She wiped her eyes with a tattered sleeve. "But when we arrived, they just laughed, called us names, said no man would want us. Then they drove us out." Bob's jaw tightened. He'd left civilization partly because of such meanness, preferring the honest harshness of the mountains to the cruelty of people. The pot of beans he'd prepared for his solitary supper suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. "Ain't much," he said, moving to stir the beans, "but you're welcome to share what I got." The women murmured their thanks, and Bob found himself pulling out every tin cup and bowl he owned. As he ladled out portions, he noticed their hands shaking, not just from cold, but from hunger too. How long had they been wandering in the snow? His small table couldn't seat them all, so they sat where they could, on his few chairs, his trunk, even on the floor. The cabin filled with the sounds of spoons scraping against tin and the quiet sighs of people eating their first meal in too long. "Name's Robert Boone," he offered finally, uncomfortable with the silence that had fallen. "Most folks just call me Bob." One by one, they introduced themselves, though the names blurred together in his mind. He'd gone so long without company that the simple act of remembering names felt like trying to learn a foreign language. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Bob added another log, conscious of how quickly his winter wood supply would dwindle with 11 people to keep warm. But he couldn't think about that now. These women needed help, and something deep inside him, something he thought had died with Martha, wouldn't let him turn them away. "You can stay the night," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Ain't got proper beds, but the floor near the fire is warm enough." "Mr. Boone," one of the women said softly, "we don't have anywhere else to go." The words hung in the air like smoke. Bob looked around his cabin, at the single bed in the corner, the meager supplies, the walls that suddenly seemed both too close and not nearly enough to shelter them all. He thought of the long winter ahead, of the challenges of feeding and protecting 10 extra souls in the unforgiving mountains. But then he remembered Martha again, how she'd always said God puts people in our path for a reason. He'd stopped believing in such things after she died. But now he wondered. "We'll figure something out," he said finally, surprising himself with the words. "Come morning, we'll figure something out." The relief on their faces made his throat tight. He turned away, busying himself with clearing the bowls, trying not to think too hard about how his life of carefully maintained solitude had shattered in a single evening. The quiet darkness he'd wrapped around himself like a blanket these past years had been torn away, replaced by the sound of women's voices and the weight of their trust in his protection. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the wind howled through the pines. But inside Bob's cabin, for the first time in a decade, there was warmth that came from more than just the fire. Around the crackling fire, the women began to share their stories, their voices growing stronger as warmth returned to their bodies. Bob sat in his familiar chair, listening more than speaking, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. "I'm Martha," the oldest among them began, her gray-streaked hair neatly pinned despite their ordeal. "Was a seamstress back in St. Louis before." She smoothed her skirts, a habitual gesture. "Well, I can mend anything that needs fixing." A gentle-faced woman with herbs tied to her belt spoke next. "Clara's my name. My mama taught me about healing plants and tending the sick." She glanced at Bob's sparse shelves. "I notice you've got yarrow drying there. Good for fevers." "You know your herbs then," Bob said gruffly, surprised despite himself. A fuller-figured woman with kind eyes cleared her throat. "I'm Ruth," she said softly. "Used to teach school, and I love to sing. Hymns mostly." Her cheeks colored slightly. "Though I reckon that's not much use up here in the mountains." One by one, the others shared their names and skills: cooking, cleaning, farming, preserving food. Bob's head spun trying to keep track of them all. The youngest, a slip of a girl named Mary, sat closest to the fire, her eyes bright with unshed tears. As the women talked, Bob pulled out every quilt and blanket he owned. It wasn't nearly enough for 10 people, but they'd have to make do. He noticed how they tried to hide their yawns, how their hands shook slightly as they accepted the bedding. How long had they gone without proper rest or food? The night passed fitfully, with the women huddled close to the fire on their makeshift beds. Bob lay awake in his own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of breathing and quiet murmurs, so different from his years of solitude. Morning brought no relief from the storm. Wind howled through the pines, driving snow against the cabin windows. Bob rose early, as was his habit, and began preparing a pot of porridge. It was simple fare, just oats and water, but it would fill empty bellies. As he stirred the pot, movement caught his eye. The women were already awake, moving quietly around his cabin. Martha folded blankets with precise corners, while 2 others swept the rough wooden floor with his old broom. Mary, the youngest, stood by his bookshelf, carefully lifting something. "Found your Bible, sir," she said softly, holding the worn book with reverence. Would you mind if I read a bit?" Bob's throat tightened. That Bible had been Martha's, his Martha's. She'd read from it every morning, her voice sweet and sure. He hadn't touched it since her passing. "Go ahead," he managed. Mary opened the book carefully, her finger tracing the familiar words. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began reading, her voice clear in the morning quiet. "I shall not want." The other women paused in their work, heads bowing slightly as the familiar psalm filled the cabin. Bob stirred the porridge mechanically, memories washing over him. Martha reading those same words, her face glowing in the morning light, her faith steady as the mountains themselves. After a simple breakfast of porridge, the women gathered their courage. Clara spoke for the group. "Mr. Boone, sir, we know we're a burden on your supplies, but we're not afraid of work. If you'll let us stay, we can help with whatever needs doing." Bob frowned, studying their determined faces. "Ain't proper, having 10 women living in a man's cabin." "Proper stopped mattering when they left us to freeze," Martha said firmly. "We're asking for a chance, nothing more." Bob sighed heavily, but nodded. "Woodpile needs tending. Water barrel's getting low, too." They set to work with surprising efficiency. The younger women split kindling while the others formed a line to the creek, passing buckets of water. Bob watched from the doorway, noticing how they worked together without complaint, despite their city clothes and obvious exhaustion. Inside, Martha and Clara had somehow transformed his bachelor's chaos into something resembling order. His few dishes were washed and stacked neatly. The floor was cleaner than he'd seen it in years, and someone had even mended the tear in his winter coat that he'd been ignoring for months. As the morning wore on, Bob found himself drawn into their quiet industry. He showed them how to stack the wood properly against the wind, explained which creek spots stayed unfrozen longest, demonstrated how to bank the fire to keep it burning through the night. The cabin, so long silent except for the wind and his own breathing, now hummed with life. The soft murmur of women's voices, the scrape of the broom, the clank of his mother's old kettle being put to use, sounds that should have grated after so many years alone. Instead, they seemed to fill a void he hadn't known was there. When Ruth began humming an old hymn as she worked, others joined in softly. The familiar tune drifted through the cabin like a warm breeze, and Bob felt something inside him shift, like ice breaking up in spring. 2 days passed like a dream in Bob's cabin. The steady fall of snow outside created a cocoon of warmth and activity within. The constant scratch of needles and quiet conversations filled spaces that had known only silence for years. Bob found himself pausing in his daily tasks, caught off guard by the transformation of his home. Martha and 2 others had salvaged fabric from their tattered dresses to make mittens for everyone. Their nimble fingers worked thread through wool, patching holes and reinforcing seams. The rich scent of Clara's herbal tea drifted through the cabin, made from dried plants she'd discovered in Bob's stores. "This yarrow will keep the cold at bay," she explained, pressing a steaming cup into his calloused hands. Bob sipped the bitter brew without complaint, noting how the younger women seemed stronger after drinking it. The evening meals had become something remarkable. Despite their limited supplies, the women worked miracles with his stores of beans and dried meat. They'd found ways to make hearty stews that reminded Bob of his mother's cooking, though he kept that thought to himself. As they ate, Ruth would begin to sing, her voice clear and sweet in the firelit cabin. Other voices would join in, harmonizing on familiar hymns that Bob hadn't heard since his wife's passing. The music stirred something in his chest, an ache he'd thought long buried under years of mountain silence. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," Ruth sang, and Bob found his throat tightening at the words. He'd turn away, pretending to tend the fire, but the women's voices followed him, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. On the 3rd morning, as Bob checked his trap lines near the cabin, a different sound cut through the crisp air, the distinctive crunch of horse hooves in snow. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle as a figure emerged from the swirling white. The rider wore a deputy's badge that caught the weak winter light. Snow dusted his heavy coat, and his young face was red from the cold. Bob recognized him from his rare trips into Leadville, a new deputy eager to prove himself. "Mr. Boone," the deputy called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "Need to speak with you about them women you're harboring." Bob's jaw tightened. "Better come inside then. Weather's not fit for talking out here." The women fell silent as the two men entered the cabin. Bob noticed how they drew together, their faces tight with fear. The deputy's eyes swept the room, taking in the neat beds, the mended clothes, the pot of stew simmering on the stove. "I'm here on official business," the deputy announced, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "These women are under legal indenture to Mr. Harrison, owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon in Leadville. He's got papers proving he paid for their passage west in exchange for their labor." "That's a lie!" Mary burst out, then shrank back as the deputy turned toward her. Martha stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "We paid our own way west. That contract is forged. Mr. Harrison tried to force us to work in his saloon, doing things no decent woman would." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, but held out the paper. "Contract looks legal to me, ma'am. Got proper stamps and everything." Bob took the document, studying it while keeping one eye on the deputy's face. The young man wouldn't meet his eyes, and his fingers kept touching his badge like it was a talisman. "You believe this is right?" Bob asked quietly. "Forcing these women into service?" "Ain't about what I believe," the deputy replied, but doubt crept into his voice. "It's about the law. Mr. Harrison says they owe him, and he's got the paper to prove it." Ruth stepped forward, her usual gentle demeanor hardened into something stronger. "The law also says thou shalt not bear false witness. That man is lying, and in your heart, you know it." The deputy's face flushed. He straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim his authority. "I'm giving fair warning, Mr. Boone. These women need to return to Leadville. If they don't come willing, I'll be back with enough men to make them. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He turned and strode out of the cabin. They listened to the sound of his horse moving away through the snow, until even that was swallowed by the winter silence. Bob stared at the paper in his hands, the weight of it somehow heavier than any load of firewood. The women watched him, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. "He'll be back," Bob said finally, "and he'll bring trouble with him." "We can leave," Clara offered quietly. "We don't want to bring trouble to your door." Bob looked around his cabin at the signs of life and care these women had brought to his solitary existence. He thought of sending them back to Harrison's false claims and cruel intentions. The very idea made his stomach turn. "You'll stay," he said gruffly, "but we need to figure out what we're going to do when they come back, because now we're all on the wrong side of the law." After the deputy's horse hooves faded into the distance, silence settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Bob stood by the window, watching snowflakes dance in the failing light. Behind him, he could hear the women's nervous whispers and the soft crackle of the fire. When darkness finally claimed the mountain, Bob settled into his worn chair by the hearth. The women had retreated to their makeshift beds, but he knew few of them slept. His fingers found his wife's old Bible, dusty from years of neglect. The leather cover felt both familiar and strange in his hands. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with disuse, "I ain't been much for talking to you since Sarah passed." He paused, struggling with words that had grown rusty. "But these women, they need guidance, and so do I." The fire popped and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Bob wrestled with his conscience deep into the night. The law said one thing, but his heart, and the faith he'd nearly forgotten, said another. As dawn's gray light crept through the cabin windows, Bob's mind was made up. He rose, joints creaking from his night vigil, and stirred the breakfast fire to life. When the women began to stir, he faced them with newfound resolve. "You'll stay," he announced gruffly, spooning out portions of morning porridge. "But you'll earn your keep. I ain't running no charity house up here." Martha's eyes filled with tears of relief. "We'll work hard, Mr. Boone. You won't regret this." True to their word, the women threw themselves into cabin life with determination. Martha and 3 others took to his pile of mending with skilled hands, their needles flashing in the firelight as they repaired years of neglect. Bob watched in amazement as his threadbare shirts and worn coats took on new life under their care. Clara organized the cabin's scattered tools and supplies, bringing order to chaos. She found his collection of rifles, dusty and unused, and supervised their careful cleaning. The weapons gleamed again, ready for whatever trouble might come. The smell of fresh bread began to fill the cabin daily. Ruth had discovered his cache of flour, and though they used it sparingly, managed to produce hearty loaves that made his usual fare seem like feast days. In return, Bob found himself sharing the knowledge that had kept him alive in the mountains. He took them out in small groups, showing them how to set rabbit snares in the snow. "Watch how the wire sits," he explained, demonstrating the technique. "Too high, and the rabbit goes under. Too low, and it jumps over." He taught them to split wood efficiently, showing them how to use the log's natural grain. "Don't waste strength fighting the wood," he'd say. "Let the axe do the work." Tracking lessons came next. Bob walked them through the snow-covered forest, pointing out the stories written in the white blanket beneath their feet. "See here?" Deer passed through before dawn. "And there, fox tracks, probably hunting the same rabbits we are." The women proved to be apt pupils, their determination making up for their lack of experience. Each evening, they gathered around the fire, sharing the day's small victories and failures. Ruth would lead them in hymns, their voices carrying through the cabin's sturdy logs and out into the mountain night. But the threat of the deputy's return hung over them like a storm cloud. One evening, as Bob sat oiling his favorite rifle, he decided it was time to speak plainly. "Deputy won't come alone next time," he said, running the oiled cloth along the barrel. The women's sewing and talking quieted as they turned to listen. "Harrison's got money and influence in Leadville. He'll send enough men to make sure he gets what he wants." Martha set down her mending. "What can we do?" "We need to be ready," Bob replied, checking the rifle's action. "Might come to shooting. I won't force any of you to stay if you're not willing to face that." Clara stood, her face set with determination. "We'd rather face bullets than go back to that man's saloon. Whatever comes, Mr. Boone, we stand with you." One by one, the other women nodded their agreement. Bob looked at their faces, seeing not the frightened refugees who'd appeared at his door, but strong women who'd chosen to fight for their freedom. "Then we'd best be prepared," he said, reaching for another rifle to clean. "Tomorrow I'll teach you all to shoot. Pray we won't need it, but better to know how." Ruth's voice rose soft and clear in the firelit cabin, starting the hymn they'd all come to know. "Be not afraid, I go before you always." The other voices joined in, their harmony stronger than ever before, and even Bob found himself humming along as he worked. December brought deeper snows and sharper winds to the mountain cabin. Yet inside, something was changing. The warmth wasn't just from the crackling fire anymore. It came from the life that now filled every corner of Bob's once lonely home. One morning, as frost painted delicate patterns on the window panes, Martha looked up from her mending. "Christmas is coming," she said softly. "Might we gather some pine boughs to brighten the cabin?" Bob glanced up from his whittling, surprised to realize he'd lost track of the season. How many Christmases had he let pass unmarked since Sarah's death? "Reckon we could," he said, his voice gruff to hide the sudden tightness in his throat. The next day, Bob led a small group into the forest. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as they sought the fullest branches. The sharp scent of pine filled the cold air, bringing memories of happier holidays. "These ones are perfect," Clara called, pointing to a cluster of low-hanging boughs. Bob showed them how to cut the branches cleanly, preserving the tree while gathering what they needed. Their arms soon filled with fragrant greenery. Back in the cabin, the women transformed the space. They draped pine boughs along the rough-hewn walls and wound them around the window frames. The fresh pine scent mixed with wood smoke, creating an aroma that stirred long-buried memories in Bob's heart. Ruth organized a group to make ornaments from scraps of cloth and bits of wood. Their hands stayed busy through the short December days, creating simple but cheerful decorations. Some women twisted fabric into small flowers, while others used Bob's carving knife to shape wooden stars. "Ain't much," Bob commented, watching them work. But his words held no criticism, only wonder at how these cast-off women could create beauty from such humble materials. "It's perfect," Ruth assured him, hanging a cloth flower near the window. "Sometimes the simplest things bring the most joy." As the days shortened toward Christmas Eve, Bob found himself smiling more often. He caught himself humming along with Ruth's hymns as he worked, something he hadn't done since Sarah passed. The cabin, once a shelter of mere survival, had become a home again. On Christmas Eve, they gathered for a special supper. The table was simple: beans flavored with the last of Clara's dried herbs, cornbread made from carefully rationed flour, and a rabbit stew. But to Bob, it felt like a feast. After the meal, Clara approached him with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "We wanted to thank you," she said, pressing it into his hands. "Each of us contributed something." Bob unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside lay a leather pouch filled with dried herbs, their sharp, clean scent rising up to meet him. "For your shoulder," Clara explained. "I've seen how it pains you in the cold. These will help, brewed as tea or packed against the ache." His throat tight with emotion, Bob reached beneath his bed and pulled out a rough burlap sack. "Got something for you all, too," he mumbled. One by one, he distributed simple wooden spoons, each one carved by his own hands during the long evening hours. The women exclaimed over the spoons, running their fingers along the smooth handles and admiring the slight variations that made each one unique. Bob had carved each spoon thinking of its recipient: a slightly deeper bowl for Ruth, who loved soup, a longer handle for tall Martha. "They're beautiful," Ruth whispered, clutching hers close. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, she began to sing. "Silent night, holy night," her clear voice rose to the cabin's rafters, and one by one, the other women joined in. Bob sat in his chair by the fire, letting the harmony wash over him. The women's voices blended like church bells, carrying peace and hope through the mountain night. He thought of other Christmas Eves spent alone, drowning in grief and silence. Now, watching the firelight play across these faces he'd come to know and care for, he realized something had changed within him. Outside, snow began to fall, thick white flakes drifting past the windows. The cabin felt snug and secure, wrapped in harmony and warmth. Bob looked at the women, Martha sewing by candlelight, Clara sorting her herbs, Ruth leading another carol, and saw not strangers he'd taken in from charity, but family he'd been blessed with. The pine boughs released their sweet scent into the warm air. Cloth flowers and wooden stars swayed gently in the draft from the chimney. Bob closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment settle into his bones. For the first time in years, he felt complete. These women, with their determination and gentle strength, had brought Christmas back to his mountain home. More than that, they'd brought back the meaning of family. The peaceful Christmas evening shattered like ice. Just as Ruth finished leading another hymn, heavy boots crunched in the snow outside. Shouts pierced the night air, and the warm glow of lanterns cast moving shadows through the frosted windows. "Get out here, Boone!" a commanding voice bellowed. "We've got business!" Bob rose from his chair, his weathered face hardening. "Stay back," he warned the women, who huddled together near the fire. He gripped his rifle and moved toward the door. Before he could reach it, the cabin door burst open with a thunderous crack. Cold wind and snow swirled in, along with 5 armed men. Their leader stepped forward, the saloon owner himself, wearing a fine wool coat and an expression of cruel triumph. "Merry Christmas," the saloon owner sneered, holding up an official-looking paper. "I've brought a gift, a proper writ signed by the territorial judge himself. These women are my property, and you're harboring stolen goods?" "We ain't property!" Clara shouted, but her voice shook with fear. Bob raised his rifle. "Get out of my cabin," he growled. "These women are under my protection." The saloon owner's smile didn't waver. "Boys," he said quietly. Two men lunged at Bob before he could fire. The rifle clattered to the floor as they grappled with him. Bob's fist connected with one man's jaw, sending him staggering, but another attacker slammed a rifle butt into Bob's back. Pain exploded through his body. "Stop it, please!" Martha screamed as the remaining men began grabbing the women, dragging them toward the door. Bob fought desperately, his movements fueled by rage and protection. He managed to throw one attacker off, but then a rifle butt crashed against his temple. Stars burst in his vision. Another blow struck his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He stumbled, trying to stay on his feet. The cabin filled with screams and the sounds of struggle. Ruth's hymn book fell to the floor, pages scattering like fallen leaves. Clara's herb pouches spilled across the wooden boards. The Christmas decorations, those simple pine boughs and handmade ornaments, were trampled under heavy boots. "Get them to the wagons," the saloon owner ordered, "and teach this mountain man what happens when he meddles in other folks' business." More blows rained down on Bob. He tried to rise, but his arms wouldn't support him. Blood trickled into his eyes from a gash on his forehead. Through blurred vision, he watched helplessly as the women were forced out into the snowy night. "Bob!" Martha cried out as she was pulled past him. "Please, help us!" But he couldn't move. His body betrayed him, refusing to respond as the last of the women disappeared through the door. Their screams grew fainter as they were loaded into waiting wagons. The saloon owner stood over Bob's crumpled form. "Consider this a Christmas lesson," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "Never interfere with my business again, or next time we won't leave you breathing." Bootsteps crunched in the snow, moving away. Wagon wheels creaked, whips cracked, and horses snorted. The sounds grew distant until only the wind remained, whistling through the open door. Bob lay in the spreading pool of lamplight, blood staining the floor where his Christmas feast had been celebrated just hours before. The cabin felt vast and empty, echoing with absence. The pine boughs still released their sweet scent, but now it seemed to mock the violence that had destroyed their peaceful celebration. Minutes or hours passed. Bob couldn't tell. Cold crept in through the open door, turning his blood to ice where it stained his shirt. The fire died down to embers, and darkness claimed the cabin. He tried to move, but pain lanced through his body. His fingers brushed against something smooth, one of the wooden spoons he'd carved, now broken in the struggle. Somewhere in the night, a wolf howled. The sound carried all the loneliness and despair that filled Bob's heart. He'd failed them, failed to protect them, just as he'd failed to protect Sarah. The women who had brought life back to his home, who had trusted him to keep them safe, were gone. The last ember in the fireplace winked out, leaving Bob alone in the darkness. Snow drifted in through the open door, settling on his battered body like a shroud. The cabin, so recently filled with warmth, song, and family, stood silent and shattered in the Christmas night. Blood froze on his face as Bob lay there, broken and defeated. The happy sounds of celebration were replaced by the hollow whisper of wind and the soft pat of falling snow. Everything they had built together, the trust, the warmth, the sense of family, had been destroyed in mere minutes of violence. The Christmas decorations swayed gently in the cold breeze, casting strange shadows in the moonlight that now provided the only illumination. Bob's consciousness began to fade, but not before the full weight of his failure pressed down upon his heart. The women were gone, taken back to the very fate they had fled, and he had been powerless to stop it. Bob drifted in and out of consciousness, pain throbbing through every inch of his battered body. When his eyes finally stayed open, the cabin lay cold and dark around him. The fire had died completely, leaving only gray ashes in the hearth. His breath came out in visible puffs in the frozen air. Pushing himself to his hands and knees sent daggers of agony through his ribs. Blood had dried on the floorboards beneath him, dark and accusing. The Christmas decorations hung in tatters, pine needles scattered across the floor like broken dreams. "Got to. Get up," he muttered through split lips. The effort to reach the woodpile nearly made him pass out again. His trembling hands fumbled with kindling and matches, taking 3 attempts before a flame caught. Slowly, painfully, he built up the fire until warmth began seeping back into the cabin. Every movement was torture as he cleaned his wounds. The gash on his temple had stopped bleeding but needed stitching. He did his best with needle and thread, gritting his teeth against the pain. His ribs screamed when he wrapped them tight with strips torn from a clean shirt. The silence pressed in around him, heavier than the mountain snows outside. No gentle humming as Clara sorted her herbs. No quiet prayers from Ruth. No cheerful chatter as the women went about their tasks. Just emptiness and the crackle of flames. One day bled into the next. Bob barely slept, haunted by their faces. Martha's look of betrayal, Clara's eyes wide with fear, Ruth reaching out as she was dragged away. Their screams echoed in his dreams. He'd failed them all. By the 3rd day, he could move without gasping in pain. The bruises had turned ugly shades of purple and yellow across his body. He sat in his chair by the fire, staring into the flames, when a soft tapping came at the door. His heart jumped. Had they returned to finish him off? He reached for his spare rifle, muscles tensing despite the pain. "Bob?" a quiet voice called through the door. "Please, it's Mary." He lurched to his feet, wincing. When he opened the door, Mary stood shivering in the snow, her dress torn and dirty. Dark circles ringed her eyes, but hope blazed in them when she saw him. "Thank the Lord," she whispered, rushing inside. "I wasn't sure you'd still be alive." Bob's throat tightened as she helped him back to his chair. Her small hands were gentle as she examined his wounds. "I brought these," she said, pulling out a familiar leather pouch. "Clara slipped them to me before." Her voice caught. "She showed me how to use them for healing." Mary worked quietly, brewing Clara's herbs into a strong-smelling tea. The familiar scent brought memories flooding back, Clara tending injuries, teaching the others her healing ways. Bob's hands shook as he took the cup. "How did you escape?" he asked after drinking the bitter brew. Mary's face hardened. "They weren't watching close during the night shift at the laundry. I climbed out a window and ran." She looked down at her raw, reddened hands. "They've got the others working dawn to dusk, washing, scrubbing, hauling water. Ruth's voice is gone from the cold. Clara tends their wounds when she can, but..." Tears spilled down her cheeks. Bob's chest ached, and not just from his injuries. The women he'd sworn to protect were suffering, trapped in the very fate they'd fled. The thought of gentle Clara forced to scrub until her hands bled, of Ruth's sweet voice silenced by cruelty. It stirred something deep inside him. "We have to help them," Mary pleaded, kneeling beside his chair. "They're holding on, waiting for rescue, but they won't last much longer in those conditions." She gripped his arm. "Please, Bob, you're all we have." He stared into the fire, feeling the warmth of Mary's healing tea spread through his body. The emptiness of the past days began to fill with purpose. He couldn't turn away, not from these women who had brought life back to his cabin and his heart, not from the family God had sent to his door that snowy night. "How many guards?" he asked quietly. Mary's eyes lit up with hope. 3 during the day, only 2 at night. She squeezed his arm. "I can help. I know the layout, the schedules." Bob nodded slowly, mind already turning over possibilities. His body was healing, and with Mary's help, with Clara's herbs, he would soon be strong enough to act. The women needed him, and this time he wouldn't fail them. "Rest now," he told Mary, patting her hand. We've got planning to do." She smiled through her tears, relief clear on her young face. The cabin didn't feel quite so empty anymore. A spark of hope had returned, kindled by Mary's courage and trust. Bob knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but he could no longer hide in his mountain solitude. His family needed him. The old mule snorted steam into the frigid mountain air as Bob secured the leather harness to his wooden sled. His ribs still ached with every movement, but Clara's herbs had worked wonders. He could at least mount up without seeing stars dance before his eyes. Mary worked alongside him, checking the bindings on their supplies with careful fingers. She had wrapped herself in one of the quilts the women had mended during their stay, her face half hidden beneath a borrowed wool scarf. Only her eyes showed, bright with determination. "Trail's gonna be treacherous," Bob warned, testing the mule's leads. "Ice under all that snow. Might take us till nightfall." "Don't matter how long it takes," Mary replied, her voice muffled by the scarf. "Just so long as we get there." The journey down the mountain proved as difficult as Bob had feared. The mule picked its way carefully along the narrow trail, hooves crunching through crusted snow. Steep drops fell away on one side, while thick pines crowded close on the other. The sled runners creaked and groaned over every bump and dip. Mary sat silent beside him, shoulders tense. Bob knew she was thinking about the others, Clara, Ruth, Martha, all of them suffering in the saloon owner's grip. His own jaw clenched tight whenever he pictured their faces. The short winter day was already fading when they finally caught sight of Leadville's scattered buildings through the trees. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys in the still cold air. The saloon's gaudy sign stood out even in the gathering gloom, its paint garish against weathered wood. "There," Mary whispered, pointing to a side alley. "We can leave the mule there, out of sight." Bob guided them carefully between buildings, the sled runners hushing through fresh snow. Once the mule was secured, they crept toward the saloon's back wall. Warm light spilled from its frosted windows, along with the sound of rough laughter and piano music. "Up there," Mary said, indicating a window just above head height. "We can see the main room." Bob helped boost her up for a better look, trying not to grunt at the strain on his healing ribs. Through the crystalline patterns of frost, they could make out the saloon's interior. The sight made his blood boil. Clara moved slowly between tables, her usual grace gone as she carried heavy trays of drinks. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, dark circles visible beneath her eyes even at this distance. Martha scrubbed the floorboards on hands and knees while drunken miners stepped around, and sometimes on, her work. Ruth struggled with a barrel nearly as big as herself, her lips moving in what Bob knew must be prayer. A burst of cruel laughter drew their attention. A group of men had gathered around Martha, making sport of her industry. One kicked dirty snow across the boards she had just cleaned. Another grabbed her arm, forcing her to look up at him as he spoke words they couldn't hear through the glass. Bob's hands curled into fists. The old rage rose in him, demanding action. It would be so easy to burst in there, guns blazing. "Bob?" Mary's hand touched his arm. "We can't help them that way. The owner, he keeps the papers locked in his desk upstairs. The contracts, the letters that prove he brought us here under false pretenses. Without those..." She was right. Violence would only land him in jail. Or worse, leaving the women with no protector at all. They needed proof of the saloon owner's fraud. Needed the law on their side this time. "Show me where he keeps them," Bob whispered. Mary pointed to a window on the second floor. "His office, but the desk is always locked, and there are always men watching the stairs." Bob studied the building's layout, considering options. A frontal assault would fail. Sneaking in at night would be too risky. If they were caught, any evidence they found would be worthless. They needed legitimate authority behind them. The image of the town's small church caught his eye, its steeple stark against the darkening sky. The preacher there was known as a fair man, one who spoke out against corruption when he found it. "Perhaps..." "Come on," Bob said, helping Mary down from her perch. "We'll find a place to sleep tonight. Tomorrow morning we're going to church." "Church?" Mary's eyes widened with understanding. "The preacher? He could help?" Bob nodded, leading her back toward the mule. "Man of God's got influence in a town like this. If we can convince him the contracts are forged, get him to stand with us." He patted Mary's shoulder. "Truth's got power all its own, girl, more than fists or guns sometimes." They found shelter in an abandoned miner's shack on the town's edge. As they huddled near their small fire, Bob watched Mary drift into uneasy sleep. The rage still burned in his chest, but it had crystallized into something harder, more focused. Come morning, they would seek justice rather than revenge. He touched the Bible in his coat pocket, the one the women had read from during their time in his cabin. Its presence reminded him that the Lord worked in mysterious ways. Perhaps this was why those 10 women had been led to his door that snowy night, not just for him to protect them, but to help him find his way back to faith and community. Bob settled back against the rough wall, alert for any sound of pursuit. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, they needed rest and preparation, and prayer. Definitely prayer. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Bob and Mary approached the weathered clapboard church. The small building stood humble against the brightening horizon, its white paint peeling and its single bell silent in the early morning air. Bob adjusted his collar, suddenly conscious of his rough appearance. His bruises had faded to yellow, but his clothes still bore the marks of mountain living. Mary walked beside him, her borrowed shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. The church door creaked as they entered. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow across empty pews. Reverend Carter stood at the altar, arranging his Bible for morning services. He looked up at their footsteps, his expression curious but welcoming. "Can I help you, friends?" the Reverend asked, moving down the center aisle to meet them. His voice was gentle, matching his weathered face and graying hair. "Reckon you might," Bob said, removing his hat. "Got ourselves a matter needs attention from a man of God." Mary stepped forward, her hands clasped tight. "It's about the saloon owner, Reverend, and what he's done to us women." They settled into a front pew as Mary explained their story. Bob watched Reverend Carter's face grow increasingly grave as she described the forged contracts, the false promises, and the brutal treatment at the saloon. When she finished, the preacher sat in silence for a long moment. "I've had my suspicions about that man," Carter finally said, shaking his head. "Several women have passed through looking haunted, but none would speak up. Fear's a powerful weapon." He turned to Bob. "And you've been sheltering them?" "Did, till they was taken," Bob admitted. "Couldn't stand by and watch them freeze in the mountains." The Reverend nodded slowly. "The Lord puts challenges in our path to test our hearts." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've heard whispers about forged papers before, but without proof." "That's why we came to you," Mary said eagerly. "The contracts are in his desk upstairs. If we could just get to them." "Breaking and entering isn't exactly Christian behavior," Carter mused, though his eyes held a glint of determination. "But neither is enslaving God's children through fraud." He stood, straightening his collar. "I might have an idea." As evening approached, Bob watched from the shadows as Reverend Carter strode purposefully toward the saloon. The preacher's Bible was tucked under one arm, his face set with righteous purpose. Mary crouched beside Bob, barely breathing. Carter's voice rang out clear and strong as he entered the saloon. "Brothers and sisters, on this cold evening let us lift our spirits with song." A few groans rose from the patrons, but Carter was already launching into a rousing hymn. To Bob's surprise, several voices joined in, including Ruth's clear soprano from behind the bar. The sound swelled, filling the main room. "Now," Bob whispered. They slipped through the back door while the singing continued, finding the narrow stairs to the second floor. Their footsteps were muffled by the hymns drifting up from below. The owner's office was locked, but Bob had come prepared. He worked the iron poker between door and frame, applying steady pressure until the lock gave with a snap. Inside, the desk dominated the small room, its surface cluttered with papers and ledgers. Mary kept watch at the door, while Bob attacked the desk's locked drawer with the poker. The wood splintered around the lock, but finally yielded. Inside lay a neat bundle of contracts, tied with twine. Bob's hands shook slightly as he untied them. The signatures at the bottom of each page were clearly all written by the same hand. The same flowing script repeated 10 times over, with only the names changed. "Got 'em," he whispered, stuffing the papers inside his coat. Footsteps suddenly sounded in the hall. Mary's eyes went wide with fear. Bob grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back stairs, a narrow servant's access they'd noticed earlier. They slipped through the door just as voices approached the office. The back stairs were steep and dark. They descended as quietly as possible, Bob's heart pounding with each step. Behind them, angry shouts erupted as the broken desk was discovered. They emerged into the cold night air, the hymn singing still audible through the saloon's walls. Without a word, they hurried through the shadows toward the church, where Reverend Carter would meet them later. Bob clutched the evidence inside his coat, feeling the weight of the papers against his chest. These contracts represented not just hope for the women, but justice itself. With proof of the owner's fraud in hand and the Reverend's support, they could finally free Ruth, Clara, Martha, and all the others from their false bondage. Mary's hand found his arm as they hurried through the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on us." Bob squeezed her shoulder, remembering the lonely silence of his cabin before these women had entered his life. "Ain't nobody gonna be in bondage while I draw breath," he said softly. "That's a promise." Morning light streamed through the sheriff's office windows as Bob spread the contracts across the scarred wooden desk. The papers rustled beneath his calloused fingers, while Mary and Reverend Carter stood quietly behind him. Sheriff Wilson's weathered face remained impassive as he examined each document. "These are serious accusations," the sheriff said, running a hand through his graying hair. "Forgery ain't something I can take lightly, one way or another." Bob leaned forward, his voice rough with urgency. "Take a look at them signatures, Sheriff. Every last one, written by the same hand. Ain't natural for 10 different women to write exactly alike." The sheriff pulled open a drawer and withdrew a stack of town records. His eyes moved between the documents, comparing the flowing script of the contracts to the angular signatures in the town's ledgers. Minutes stretched like hours as he studied them. Finally, he frowned. "Names don't match our records," he admitted, "but the saloon owner, he's got influence in this town, provides a lot of business, pays a lot of taxes." "Since when does money trump justice?" Bob's fist came down on the desk, making the inkwell rattle. "Them women are being held against their will on account of lies." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself, Boone. This needs to be handled proper-like." "Then handle it proper," Bob growled. "You're wearing that badge for a reason." Reverend Carter stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Sheriff Wilson, I've known you 15 years, seen you uphold the law without fear or favor." He placed his Bible on the desk. "The good book tells us that justice should flow like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Will you let that stream be dammed by one man's gold?" The sheriff's fingers drummed against his desk while silence filled the room. Mary twisted her shawl nervously, watching his face. Outside, the sounds of the awakening town filtered through the windows. Wagon wheels on packed dirt, horses nickering, shopkeepers calling greetings. At last, the sheriff straightened. "I'll convene a hearing, tonight at the courthouse." He held up a hand as Bob started to speak. "That's the proper way. Everyone gets their say, everything out in the open." "Much obliged," Bob said, though his eyes remained hard. "We'll be there." Word spread through Leadville like wildfire. By evening, it seemed half the town had packed into the courthouse. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of miners, merchants, and townsfolk. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls as the sun set beyond the windows. Bob sat with Mary and Reverend Carter in the front row. Behind them, whispers rustled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. The other women from the saloon had been brought in under guard, their faces showing equal measures of hope and fear. The door burst open with a bang. The saloon owner strode in, flanked by 4 armed men. His expensive coat seemed to catch all the lamplight, and his clean-shaven face was dark with fury. He took his place at the defendant's table, shooting venomous glances at Bob. Sheriff Wilson entered last, his badge gleaming as he took his place behind the judge's bench. The crowd fell silent. "This hearing is now in session," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "We're here to examine evidence of alleged forgery in certain labor contracts." He looked toward Bob. "Present your case." Bob stood, his rough mountain man's frame towering over the courtroom. He laid out the contracts one by one, explaining how they'd been discovered. Mary testified about the women's ordeal, the false promises, the forced labor, the threats. Reverend Carter spoke of his suspicions and the pattern of abuse he'd witnessed. The saloon owner's lawyer tried to object, claiming the contracts were obtained illegally, but the sheriff overruled him, saying evidence of a crime couldn't be dismissed just because it was found through irregular means. Throughout it all, the armed men stood along the back wall, their hands never far from their weapons. The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife, while outside, darkness settled over the mountain town. Bob noticed one of the younger women, Emma, trembling as she looked at her former captor. He caught her eye and gave a slight nod, trying to convey strength. They had come too far to falter now. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The saloon owner's face grew redder with each piece of evidence presented. His fingers drummed against the table in a nervous rhythm, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His influence in the town had always relied on shadows and whispers. Now everything was being dragged into the light. The courthouse grew stuffier as more townspeople squeezed in to witness the proceedings. The air felt electric with anticipation as the sheriff examined the final pieces of evidence, comparing signatures one last time under the yellow lamplight. All eyes turned to the bench, waiting for the sheriff's next words. Justice hung in the balance, as delicate as a feather on the edge of a knife. The saloon owner shot to his feet, his face mottled with rage. "This is nonsense," he shouted, pointing at the women. "I own their contracts. They're my property, fair and square." The crowd murmured as Bob stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Without a word, he gathered the forged papers and brought them to Sheriff Wilson's desk, laying them down with a decisive snap. The lamplight caught the identical signatures, making their fraudulent nature even more apparent. "Property." Bob's voice was quiet but carried through the courthouse. "Ain't no man can own another. These papers here are written in lies." Sheriff Wilson adjusted his spectacles, studying the contracts with renewed attention. "We'll hear from witnesses," he announced. "Reverend Carter, step forward." The Reverend rose, straightening his black coat. His normally gentle voice took on steel as he addressed the court. "For months, I've watched good people afraid to speak against this man," he gestured toward the saloon owner. "I've seen him threaten families, forge documents, use his money to bend the law. These women aren't the first he's tried to enslave through false papers." The saloon owner's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! This is hearsay and slander." "Let him speak," Sheriff Wilson commanded, his eyes never leaving the contracts. Before Carter could continue, movement near the back of the courthouse drew everyone's attention. A tall Apache man stood, his dignified bearing causing the crowd to fall silent. Bob recognized Henry, who lived near the reservation boundary and sometimes traded at frontier posts. "I have words to speak," Henry said, his voice clear and steady. He walked to the front, ignoring the whispers that followed him. The saloon owner's face had gone pale. "I was there," Henry continued, "when these women first came to Leadville. I saw this man. He pointed at the saloon owner. Hold them at gunpoint behind his saloon. He told them they would sign or die in the snow. My people know about broken promises and false papers. I could not stay silent today. A shocked hush fell over the courthouse. Henry's testimony carried the weight of truth, and even the saloon owner's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The women were crying softly, nodding at Henry's words. Sheriff Wilson removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he studied the contracts one final time. The oil lamps sputtered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I've seen enough, he declared, standing behind his desk. These contracts were obtained through threat of violence and forged signatures. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I declare them null and void. He fixed the saloon owner with a hard stare. These women are free. Joy erupted in the courthouse. The women embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. Bob felt a weight lift from his shoulders as Mary grabbed his hand, squeezing it in gratitude. But the moment of celebration was short-lived. With a roar of rage, the saloon owner lunged forward, reaching inside his coat. You'll regret this, he snarled. But before he could draw his weapon, 2 deputies seized his arms, forcing them behind his back. Take him to the jail, Sheriff Wilson ordered, as the man struggled and cursed. We'll add attempted assault in a courthouse to his charges. The deputies dragged the saloon owner away, his threats echoing down the street. His armed men, seeing their employer subdued, quietly slipped out of the courthouse. The crowd began to disperse, talking excitedly about the evening's events. Bob watched as the women hugged Henry, thanking him through their tears. The Apache man accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity, inclining his head slightly before moving toward the door. As he passed, Bob reached out to clasp his arm. Much obliged, Bob said softly. That took courage. Truth needs no courage, Henry replied. Only a voice. With a slight nod, he disappeared into the night. Reverend Carter approached Bob, smiling broadly. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he said, gesturing to the freed women. Sometimes through mountain men and Apache scouts. Bob ducked his head, uncomfortable with the praise. The courthouse had nearly emptied now, leaving just their small group in the lamplight. The women gathered around him, their faces shining with joy and relief. Sheriff Wilson approached, holding the voided contracts. You'll be wanting these as proof, he said, handing them to Bob. Though I reckon no one in Leadville will question their freedom after tonight. The contracts felt light in Bob's hands, just paper now, with no more power to harm. Through the courthouse windows, he could see stars appearing in the clear mountain sky. For the first time since the women had appeared at his cabin door, he felt certain he'd done right by them. The night air carried the promise of snow as they stepped outside. But now, instead of fear, it brought hope. The women were free, justice had prevailed, and somehow, in fighting for them, Bob had found his own kind of freedom from the solitude that had imprisoned him for so long. The courthouse door creaked open as Bob and the women stepped into the crisp night air. Stars sparkled overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet, and their breath formed delicate clouds in the cold. The street was filled with townsfolk who had witnessed the hearing, their faces a mix of shame and sympathy. Wait, called Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife. She hurried forward with a basket full of fresh bread. Please take this. Others followed her lead. Soon, blankets, preserved fruits, and sacks of flour appeared from shop doorways and nearby homes. We should have spoken up sooner, muttered Mr. Thompson, the general store owner, as he handed Bob a box of supplies. Weren't right what happened to you ladies. The women accepted each offering with grace, their eyes bright with tears of gratitude. Martha, the seamstress, wrapped a donated wool blanket around Mary's shoulders, while Clara carefully packed the food into their bags. As dawn broke the next morning, Bob led the group up the mountain trail. The snow lay deep and pristine, crunching beneath their boots. Wind whistled through the pine trees, carrying bitter cold, but nothing could dampen their spirits. Ruth's clear voice rose above the wind, starting a familiar hymn. One by one, the other women joined in, their song echoing across the valley. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," they sang, their voices growing stronger with each step. Even Bob found himself humming along, something he hadn't done since his wife's passing. The journey was arduous. They took frequent breaks, sharing water and dried meat, helping each other through deep snowdrifts. Bob kept a watchful eye on the sky, noting the clouds building in the west. When Mary stumbled, exhausted, he quietly took her pack without a word. As evening approached, they finally crested the last ridge. The cabin stood before them, dark and silent in the growing dusk. Snow had drifted against its walls, and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers. "Home," whispered Ruth, and the word seemed to warm the very air around them. They worked together with practiced efficiency. While Bob and two of the stronger women gathered firewood, others cleared the snow from the path. Clara and Martha went straight to the fireplace, coaxing flames from the cold ashes. Soon, 2 fires blazed, one in the hearth and another in the cooking stove. The cabin filled with movement and warmth. The scent of beef stew bubbled from the pot as women unpacked their gifts from town. Laughter rang out, true, unburdened laughter, as they reclaimed their spaces. Mary spread the new blankets on the beds, while Ruth organized the pantry with their provisions. Bob stood in the doorway, watching them work. The cabin had never felt more alive, more like the home it was meant to be. These women, who had arrived as strangers in desperate need, had become something he never expected to find again. Family. The winter winds howled outside, but inside Boone's Haven, warmth and industry flourished. Where silence once ruled, the rhythmic clack of wooden looms filled the air as the women worked wool into sturdy cloth. Clara's herbs sprouted in makeshift window boxes, their green leaves reaching toward weak winter sunlight. The scent of her healing tinctures mixed with fresh bread and pine smoke. Bob marveled at the transformation. His once sparse cabin now hummed with purpose. The women had helped him replace worn shingles, their sure hands passing up boards while he hammered. Even the old roof beams seemed to stand straighter now. One evening, as flames danced in the hearth and snow fell softly outside, Martha cleared her throat. "This place," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it's become more than just a cabin. It's truly a haven." She looked at Bob with grateful eyes. "We ought to call it Boone's Haven." The suggestion brought tears to every eye. The women nodded in agreement, their faces glowing in the firelight. Bob ducked his head, overwhelmed, his rough hands clasped together as he whispered a prayer. "Lord," he said softly, "thank you for filling my empty house with such blessing." The women joined hands in a circle, their fingers intertwined. "We're family now," Martha declared, "all of us, and this is our home." Spring crept into the mountains like a gentle awakening. Patches of earth emerged from beneath melting snow, and streams swelled with crystal-clear runoff. Tender green shoots pushed through the soil around Boone's Haven, promising new life. Word spread through the valleys about the mountain man who defied a corrupt saloon owner to protect 10 women. Visitors began appearing at the cabin's door, weary travelers, curious neighbors, and those seeking refuge of their own. Each found a warm welcome from the women, whose faces now shone with quiet confidence and joy. One crisp morning, Bob stood on a ladder, carefully hanging a wooden sign he'd carved through the winter months. The letters spelled out Boone's Haven in bold, deep strokes. Behind him, the women gathered in their Sunday best, their voices rising in a familiar hymn. Sunlight spilled across the valley, turning the remaining snow to gold. Bob stepped back, his weathered face creasing in a smile. His heart felt full to bursting. The years of lonely silence were past. Here, surrounded by his newfound family, Faith had bloomed again like the spring flowers dotting the mountainside. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.